Hello everyone, I will share real stories that I know and I'm sure you will like them.
Our kitchen sink hadn't worked right in weeks. My husband kept saying he'd get to it. Then Jason showed up. And now the sink works perfectly. But nothing else in my life ever has since. My name is Elaine, I'm 48, and I live in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Louisville, Kentucky. Married for 19 years to a man who doesn't really see me anymore. When people ask how we met, I always smile and say, college. He made me laugh. I made him late to class. It used to be a sweet story. Now it feels like a distant echo from a life I don't live anymore. These days, I spend most of my time cleaning up after people who don't seem to notice I exist. 2 adult kids, well, one in college and one still finishing high school. A husband who works 12-hour shifts, comes home, eats, and passes out in his recliner. He used to touch my back when he walked by. Used to ask how I was doing. Now he just asks if we have milk. Our house is always quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in a way that makes you feel more alone than being alone ever could. I bake bread sometimes just to fill the air with something warm. I light candles even though no one ever comes over. I wear lipstick on Sundays because I want to remember what it feels like to be seen. The sink started leaking on a Tuesday. I noticed the cabinet below was wet, and when I opened it, water had soaked through the wood. I cursed under my breath and left a towel there. When I asked my husband, "Can you take a look at the sink?" he barely looked up from the game. Yeah, this weekend. It was Thursday before I called the number taped to the community bulletin board at the grocery store. Handyman. Plumbing. No job too small. His name was Jason. He showed up the next morning in a faded navy t-shirt and jeans, toolbox in one hand, coffee in the other. He had one of those calm, steady voices. A little rough, a little southern. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his head like people used to do. "Heard you've got a sink with some attitude." I laughed without meaning to. I hadn't laughed like that in weeks. He crouched down under the sink, grunting slightly, and I leaned against the counter, watching him work. Something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he wasn't in a rush to get away, made my chest feel tight. Not in a painful way. In a way I didn't expect. When he stood up to check the faucet, his forearm brushed mine. Just a second. But I felt it all the way down to my stomach. He came back 2 more times. Said the parts he needed had to be ordered, and it'd take a day or 2. Each time, he stayed a little longer. Told me stories while he worked. About his dog, about how he used to live out west. I told him about my sourdough starter. About how my youngest used to beg for pancakes every Saturday. About how my husband once danced with me in the kitchen at midnight. I don't know why I said that last part. I think I just wanted to remember it out loud. Jason didn't flirt. Not exactly. But he listened. Really listened. He made jokes that were just inappropriate enough to make me blush. Then he'd smile like he knew. At one point, I offered him lemonade. He leaned back on his heels and looked up at me from the floor. "Only if you drink it with me." We sat on the back porch, him still in his work shirt, me still in the same blouse I'd worn 3 days in a row. He said, "You always this kind?" I said, "Only when someone notices." He looked at me then. Really looked. The kind of look that makes your skin feel like it doesn't fit right anymore. When he finally fixed the sink, I felt a weird pang in my chest. Like I didn't want it to be over. He wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Should be good now." I nodded, pretending to check the faucet. "Thank you." Jason tilted his head. "You okay?" I wanted to say no. I haven't been okay for a long time. But I smiled instead. "Just tired." He paused. "Well, if anything else breaks around here, you know who to call." It was 2 weeks before I saw him again. The sink was fine. But the guest toilet had started running and wouldn't stop. I could have asked my husband. I didn't. Jason answered on the first ring. Said he'd come by the next day. This time, when he walked in, he didn't smell like motor oil and grass. He smelled like cedar and soap. Like he'd showered before coming over. I told myself not to read into it. But when I offered coffee, he said yes. We sat at the table while the tank refilled. He talked about his ex. I talked about my kids. Then it got quiet. He said, "You ever think about just leaving it all behind?" I looked up. He wasn't smiling. I said, "Sometimes. But where would I go?" Jason leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Anywhere. Somewhere warm. Somewhere nobody expects anything from you." He reached out, touched my hand. Just lightly. I didn't pull away. I didn't move at all. And in that moment, the sound of the running toilet faded, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My lips parted. I don't know why. I wasn't going to say anything. I wasn't going to do anything. But I didn't stop him when he stood up. I didn't stop him when he walked around the table. And I didn't stop myself when I looked up into his eyes and let my breath catch. He whispered, "Tell me to go." And I didn't. The next morning, everything felt off. The kitchen light was too bright. The chair legs scraped louder than usual. Even the floor creaked under my feet like it was holding a secret. My husband sat at the table eating toast, scrolling through his phone, same as always. He didn't ask why I'd gotten up early. He didn't ask where I'd been last night. Not that I'd gone anywhere. I just stayed up. In the guest bathroom. Sitting on the closed toilet lid long after Jason left, staring at the tile and trying to remember how to breathe. He hadn't kissed me. Not really. Not fully. But it was enough to split something wide open in me. His scent still lingered in the hallway. Like sawdust and skin and something else I couldn't name. I burned my eggs. I forgot to feed the dog. I left the faucet running for 2 full minutes and just stared at the water. I didn't even realize I was crying until my husband looked up and said, "You okay?" I nodded. And I lied. Later that afternoon, I walked into the living room and stood there, staring at our wedding photo. It sat crooked in the frame, the glass smudged. I thought about straightening it, but I didn't. Because it wasn't just the photo that was crooked. I was too. Jason texted me that night. Just one line. "Hope everything's working better now." I stared at it for 10 minutes before typing. Not really. He didn't respond. Not right away. But the next morning, there was a knock at the door. He said he was just checking on the pipes. That sometimes they rattled after a repair. That he wouldn't stay long. But he stayed. We didn't make love. That would imply tenderness. What we did was heavier. Silent. A breath held too long. It happened in the space between one decision and the next. I let my hand stay on his shoulder. He didn't move. Then he exhaled, low and slow, and the air between us changed shape. We crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Afterward, I wiped the counter like nothing had happened. He tightened a bolt under the sink with his jaw clenched, like maybe that could undo it. We didn't speak. And still, he came back the next day. Said something about the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom. My husband never asked why the repairs took so long. He was too busy watching the weather. 3 days later, I saw Jason's truck in the driveway and my stomach flipped. Not from guilt. From want. I hated myself for that. For how quickly my mind wandered. For the way I started choosing tighter shirts. For how I stood a little longer by the window once I knew he was coming. Sometimes we didn't touch at all. Sometimes we just sat. He'd tell me about his dad, who left when he was 13. About his failed marriage. About the cabin he dreamed of buying in Tennessee. And I'd sit across from him, knees nearly brushing, heart pounding, wondering how I got here. It was emotional. Not just physical. And in some ways, that made it worse. He saw me as I hadn't been seen in years. And I let him. It happened on a Monday. Jason was in the garage. Said he needed a wrench he left behind. I was in the laundry room, folding towels, when my husband came home early. His truck door slammed harder than usual. I heard boots on the tile, heard him mutter something, and then silence. Too much silence. I stepped into the hallway and saw both of them in the kitchen. Jason holding the wrench. My husband holding his phone. He didn't look angry. He looked cold. Quiet. He held up the phone. A picture, blurry, from the doorbell camera. Me, leaning too close. Jason's hand on my hip. I didn't even remember the moment. But there it was. Evidence. My husband didn't say a word. He put the phone down, walked into the bedroom, and shut the door. That night, he didn't sleep in our bed. The next morning, half his closet was empty. He left the keys on the counter. And a note. Tell him he can finish the job. He didn't yell, didn't accuse. That made it worse. He took his toothbrush, his shaving kit, and the photo of us at Niagara Falls. The one I didn't think he even remembered. He left everything else, including me. I never saw Jason again. He never texted, never called. Maybe he figured he'd done enough damage. Or maybe he was only ever here for the sink. The house is so quiet now, it sounds like it's waiting for something that'll never come back. Every creak of the floorboard feels like a reminder. Every drip from the faucet feels like an accusation. I still wear lipstick on Sundays. Still light candles. But I stopped baking bread. The smell was too warm. Too full of memories I don't deserve. And every time I hear water running, I wonder how long it'll take me to fix everything he broke. He left the wrench. My husband left the ring. And I left everything else.